Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Experience Kills. I am your host today, Ben, and joined with me, not quite as ever, but pretty damn often, it's Richard.
I'm always here, you just don't always know it.
I like the idea that you stand outside my house in the bushes looking in. Makes me feel really safe, actually. Protecting me.
It shouldn't.
Okay. Yeah, I was trying to find the positive. Crying, really. And what we're looking at today, what we're going to talk about right now, is a game called Golem Gates, brought to us by Laser Guided Games, founded by some ex-Epic alumni. And once again, it's another game looking at how to translate the RTS genre onto a console. And this one does it with a sort of hybrid of MOBA and CCG mechanics. Now, when I say CCG, do you know what I mean, Richard?
Not a clue, and I'm sure some listeners won't either.
That's absolutely fair, and that's why I want to explain it. So what I mean is collectible card game. And the way that manifests in Golem Gates is instead of, say, you know, when you're playing an RTS game like Age of Empires, or StarCraft, you've got your build queue that, you know, you want to, you know, you're going to use every time you play. So you're going to put down your barracks, then you're going to put down your harvester, and you're going to then spawn 14 of these, and then you're going to spawn 3 of those, and you'll do an early rush, which will then be done at the same time as supporting some, say, defensive constructs in your base area like towers and walls, and then you're moving on to your vehicle bay, etc., etc., etc. Now, what we do with Golem Gates is, in a way that they've got round that, is they've brought in the CCG mechanics, which means you have a deck of spawnable and usable things. So it can be units, it could be towers, it could be direct attack powers, and things of that nature. But the reason that the CCG mechanic is interesting is that you don't get them in the same order. So you have a deck of, say, 34 cards around there, but they're not cards, they're more like icons, you know, units.
Yeah.
And then, you know, you'll have a selection of a different 7 or 8 of those at any one time. So you don't get them in the same order every time. So what that means is you have to be far more experimental, far more reactive, and far more sort of quick thinking with what you need to deploy and at what time, depending on the situation you might find yourself in. So in Golem Gates, there is a story mode, there is some time trial sort of challenge type modes, and then there's multiplayer. I couldn't test multiplayer, not from a want of trying, but from a want of being able to find any other players playing this game, which is a bit of a shame, because a game like this, which has got MOBA elements, RTS elements, and the CCG elements, is gonna really shine in multiplayer, I would have thought. You know, that's where the strength of this will come, because it will come from the unpredictability of the people you're playing against.
Yeah.
So I was pretty bummed out that I couldn't test that. And it is a shame, because I reckon this game is gonna fly under a lot of people's radars. It's not, you know, necessarily going to stand out to people. It does have a fantastic release trailer, which has got an incredibly good musical kind of cue to it, really cool tone that's set by it. But even with that, I'm not sure people are going to check this game out. But let's get back into the mechanics of the game a little bit. So you play as this sort of harbinger, this big, ominous looking dude with all like cyberpunk, gothic, sort of fantasy. It's weird look, isn't it? It's quite distinctive, isn't it, Rich?
I'll tell you what it reminds me of. I've just realised what this looks a hell of a lot like. It's very much the Bitmap Brothers vibe from the 90s, isn't it? Like Gods, that sort of era. It's got that sort of golden flesh colour palette. Everything looks shiny and hard.
Do you know the other vibe I'm getting?
Yeah.
Do you remember Too Human?
Yeah.
It's got a bit of Too Human about it, doesn't it, as well?
Yeah, sort of Viking element to it.
Yeah, there's a bit of a Norse vibe going on, but like via cyber and all kinds of weird tech, and yeah, it's like somebody's experimented on themselves, doesn't it? It feels like sort of bastardization of technology and flesh and stuff like that. But anyway, you play as Harbinger, and you know, this is your general character. You need to protect them at all costs. If your Harbinger is destroyed, that's it, it's game over. So you're going to be then moving around the field, and what you're doing when you're around the field is you kind of got these control points you want to take, and they're important because they give you the energy or the currency you need to play the units and to play the different cards from your deck. So you're controlling these points, you're getting the units, and then obviously your goal usually is to destroy the enemy's Harbinger or their sort of main control point, depending on the story justification in the level or in the challenge or in the multiplayer. So you're going to be moving around. It's quite an aggressive game, so it's all about pushing forwards. It's about grabbing these control points, and it's about, you can lay down obviously the tower defense type elements. So there are elements of traditional tower defense games where you're putting down literal turrets, of which there are quite a few different varieties, and you place them maybe around the control point, leave some units garrison, but then you're moving forwards, getting more control points, always going forward to try and take out the main enemy point or their harbinger. So that's kind of the thrust of the game, and because it's very reactive, because you don't know what you're necessarily going to get in your queue at any one time, you're kind of thinking on the fly. You're quickly deploying units, and it works quite nicely on a console. I didn't find there were too many control issues because the cursor is actually kind of smart about where it will position things. You can of course fine-tune things on the screen, but usually, especially with placing some units, it will know the best place to put them on the screen at the time. So you can just click A, deploy things rapidly. Yeah. There are of course the direct attacks, but they're almost all AoE. So like you want to drop a fireball down on some enemies, you've got a big circle you can place over them. Be careful not to hit your own enemies, your own units of course, but you can then do that as well. I found myself leaning towards building my deck because of course you can customize a deck. What would a CCG based mechanic be without deck customization? And I customized my deck to focus more on units rather than say buffs, debuffs or direct attack. So I was all about building up a big force, putting down a few turrets to support my my advancement, and then just overwhelming the enemy with lots of like low level units and these huge like rushing attacks, which I really enjoyed doing. I think there's a lot of positives to this style of gameplay. I liked how quick it felt and how immediate it felt, but it was difficult for me to judge it. I was playing on various difficulties, easy, medium and hard and stuff, to get an idea of the game, but without playing against actual people, I was difficult to see where the sort of strengths and the weaknesses of building your own deck would come from, because it's all about, if you're coming up against people playing a meta of a certain type of, say, build queue, you're going to want to try and counter that. So you're going to want to have different decks that have different strengths and weaknesses for the different types of opponents you're facing. So there's actually quite a lot of depth to that kind of customization. So obviously as you go through the challenges, as you win fights and stuff, and win battles, progress through the story, you're getting more cards that you can use to customize your deck and to have different units, all of which have got different use cases and strengths and weaknesses. So yeah, there's a lot of granular balancing and tweaking that you can do within this sort of system. I just didn't feel like I had the best opportunity to test it, which is unfortunate.
That's a shame, isn't it? Because it's only out last week, right, on consoles?
Yeah, it's a new release.
I take it it's not cross-platform then, because the PC version's been out a little while longer.
I haven't seen anything to indicate that it's cross-platform, no.
Yeah, maybe that's something they should do if they want to bolster their playing numbers, but yeah,
get the player base up.
Yeah,
it's just a bit of a shame, because I think that's where this game will really shine. I mean, it's in the gameplay itself, I think that's its strength. Some of the things I didn't love about this game, it's got a really cluttered user interface right at the top of the game. So not necessarily in a level. I actually find the user interface for deploying cards and selecting units is a bit hit and miss. It's a much more like a Halo Wars-esque all units situation, basically, where you just grab whatever's on the screen at the time and just send them up, and then just send them into attack. You're not necessarily picking individual units for different purposes, and it's actually quite difficult sometimes to differentiate the different units on the screen. For example, you'll have scout units, and it's not always easy to spot the scout unit in a big pile of units and like really be able to separate them out. There is a unit selection icons on the left hand side of the screen which you can go through with the D-pad, but it's actually quite a slow process. I think the game is very much more lent towards the idea of big rushes, large forces, direct attack, rather than sort of delineating out smaller unit groups and different control groups which you would get in a more conventional RTS.
Yeah.
And that works, and it doesn't lead to the most nuanced gameplay, but it was certainly fun in the single player just to rush. The main menu, however, is the first screen you see. It is an absolute cluster F. It's a completely confusing. It's got tabs across the top. It's got selections down the right. It just doesn't feel refined. And that's the first thing you see when you first turn on the game. It's very bewildering to actually work out where you've got to go to get into the story, where you go to do things. And it took some experimentation to actually work out what I needed to be doing and how to get to places. It's hopefully when you watch the video, if you're watching the video, that'll become clearer from what I'm describing right now. But yeah, it was just not a nice onboarding experience. It just felt a bit like, oh, you could have pared this back quite a bit. Clearly it's not where the strength of the small team lies. You know, obviously these guys are focusing on the gameplay. You know, they're the very in-depth deck builder mechanics, you know, with lots of different units. There's so much variety into the types of different armies you're going to build and different unit queues and things like that. And then obviously the visuals are very, very sharp as well. It's odd that you can't do anything with zooming in, like, or out. You have a fixed kind of perspective, and there's a huge on console, there's a huge like hand icon that floats around, which is how you can directly select things, and that felt a bit clumsy as well, to be honest. Yeah, the finite control isn't quite there, whereas the kind of the larger scope, grab all of these guys, grab my Harbinger, move them up, throw you enemies just to place the odd turret, do a few direct attacks and stuff like that. When for example, it asks, you know, the buffs and the debuffs, you can do things like healing, and you can do things like pausing enemies so they can't attack.
Yeah.
So when you get those, trying to actually select an enemy on the battlefield to say, oh, you can't attack for X amount of seconds with one of your powers is really difficult to do. If you actually want to specifically tag, say, a very powerful, larger enemy, oh, he can't attack, so he's going to be vulnerable. I just basically never built decks with that in there after some experimentation because it was way too fiddly to do on console.
So it sounds to me as if they focused more on how the battles look rather than how they function, because just looking at the videos of it, it does look impactful. Just the visual style, the proximity to the battles as well. It looks as if it's designed for maximum impact. But
yeah,
maybe you just don't have that finesse control over it to really get under the hood too much then.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There is a really interesting visual flair to this game. It's interesting when you have really large forces. It's sort of like there's a middle ground where it works really well, but when you have like a large force, like the survival modes you can play in this game, where you might just want to camp one control point. So I've played, you know, you camp in this control point, you've got half a dozen turrets down, you've got this big force, and then all of a sudden you start noticing units have pathing problems, where they can't get around the turrets, where they can't get past other units, where they get stuck, especially bigger units. And it's sort of like, well, these are bigger units I want at the front of the force, you know, really up there defending and protecting this point. However, I literally can't get them out of this huge sort of pile of units that have developed from me just building and being able to like focus on that type of construction queue. So it's a bit odd. It doesn't quite work as perfectly as maybe a really pared back MOBA or as a fully fledged RTS with a bit of a larger scope where you're dealing with, you know, hundreds of units but in a much bigger area, like a, you know, like a StarCraft or something like that.
Yeah.
But I think it's an interesting experiment. I do really like the idea of the CCG mechanic brought into an RTS. I think that works really well for keeping the engagements fresh, and that you're never quite sure what you're going to build. You know, you obviously have a focused, you know, you obviously have a deck that you've constructed, but you're never quite sure what order you're going to get things. So I think that keeps things really interesting.
Yeah.
But the strength of that is going to be in multiplayer, and if the people aren't playing it, then you're not really going to get to experience it, because that's the whole point of a CCG, is playing it against other people.
Yeah.
And in a way, the visuals of the battlefield, I think, and you really kind of captured it with your observation there from just watching the trailer, the visuals of the battlefield are to facilitate the CCG mechanics that are really at the heart of the game. It'd be almost like, imagine playing like a Pokemon CCG or a Magic the Gathering, but you actually had these units trudging across the desk at each other and hitting each other like hollow chess in Star Wars. That's the kind of vibe you're getting, you know what I mean?
I got you.
And it's nearly there. Nearly. But I definitely enjoy it. I definitely enjoy the experimental aspects of it. And yeah, it looks really nice. It's got a really good visual setting. It never quite captured the tone of that trailer. Never quite got to that dark, gothic, cyberpunk vibe. The story's quite flat. There's voice acting, there's some characterization, but it never really takes off, because really it's just there to facilitate these battles on various maps, you know, using these interesting mechanics. But it never really grabbed me. So I think that's maybe a little bit of a missed opportunity on that as well.
That's a shame, because it really does look like there's something weighty there But yeah, missed opportunity, like you say. Never mind.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep an eye on that developer. I think it's a really cool little indie project. I do think if you are interested and you do maybe play CCGs, if you are interested in RTS-like experiences on console specifically, this is definitely worth checking out. But it's hard to fully recommend because it is rough around the edges. You know, it is rough on that UI design. It's rough on some unit control and finite control, especially on console. And it's not got the story I was hoping it to have. But at its core, that mixture of CCG and RTS gameplay is, I think, a fascinating prospect, and I really hope Laser Guided Games move forwards with that idea and refine it with maybe not necessarily a sequel, but maybe more games using that idea. So yeah, I think that brings us to the end of another episode of Experience Kills. I have been your host, Ben. With me has been Richard.
Yeah, I am at Colonel Red on Twitter if you want to hook up with me.
You can find me at DIYE. You can subscribe to Experience Kills on Twitter at Experience Kills, surprisingly enough. Also, please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. It really helps. But if you don't have time to watch all these lengthy videos where we discuss games in depth, you can, of course, listen to the audio-only versions found on Spotify, iTunes, and wherever good podcasts are found. And I think that brings us to the end. And we'll be back soon with more games. See you all soon.
Bye.
Bye.